The sun filtered gently through the sheer curtains of our small living room, casting soft, dappled shadows on the worn wooden floor. I could hear my mother humming a tune while she busied herself in the kitchen, the rhythmic clattering of pots and pans a familiar symphony that accompanied our mornings. The smell of cumin and coriander wafted through the air, mingling with the sweet scent of freshly baked bread, a ritual she performed every day without fail. "Ollie, breakfast is almost ready," she called out, her voice warm and inviting. I stretched my arms above my head, feeling the slight ache in my muscles from yesterday's soccer match with the neighborhood kids. We had played until the sun dipped low, laughter echoing between the buildings, the sounds of our joy wrapping around us like a comforting blanket. I stumbled into the kitchen, still half asleep, where my mother stood at the stove, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, a few strands escaping to frame her face. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You need to eat if you want to keep up with those boys." I chuckled, settling onto one of the mismatched chairs at our small table. "I think they need to keep up with me, Mama." She shook her head, her smile widening as she set a plate of steaming food in front of me. The eggs were perfectly scrambled, just how I liked them, and the bread was still warm, the edges crisp. I took a bite, savoring the flavors, and looked around our modest home, the walls adorned with family photos, each frame telling a story. "Did you hear the news on the radio this morning?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of tea. "No. What happened?" I replied, my mouth full. "Just the usual," she waved her hand dismissively. "Some talk about the situation in the South. People are worried, but you know how it is." I nodded, though her casual tone didn't quite match the unease that lingered in the air. In our neighborhood, we often found ourselves listening to the radio, the soft crackle of the speaker filling the silence with updates on the world outside our home. But it was more background noise than anything else. It was a rhythm we had adapted to, a hum that faded into the background of our daily lives. After breakfast, I grabbed my backpack and headed out into the bustling streets of our neighborhood. The sun was bright, casting a warm glow on the faces of the people I passed. Children played hopscotch on the sidewalk, their laughter ringing out like music, while vendors shouted their daily specials from makeshift stalls. The vibrant colors of fruits and vegetables spilled over the tables, inviting and alive. "Hey, Ollie," shouted my friend Amir, waving me over. "You coming to play later?" "Of course," I replied, my heart lifting at the thought of another game. I loved those afternoons spent on the dusty field, the sun setting behind us, our laughter mingling with the fading light. As I walked towards school, I noticed the posters plastered on the walls, faded images of smiling faces with slogans urging peace. I paused for a moment, reading the words, but they felt distant, almost like a whisper from another world. My mind drifted back to the lessons we had in class, our teachers discussing the history of our land, the stories that felt heavy and far away. I tried to focus on the present, on the mundane worries of homework and soccer practice, but those words lingered at the edges of my thoughts. School was a mix of laughter and learning, the smell of chalk dust and the faint scent of old books filling the air. My classmates and I navigated the halls, exchanging jokes and stories, the kind of trivial matters that seemed so important at that age. I found comfort in the routine, the predictability of each day. During lunch, I shared a sandwich with my best friend, Layla. We sat under the shade of a large tree, its branches providing a refuge from the midday sun. "Did you hear about the new girl?" she asked, her brow furrowed in curiosity. "No. What about her?" "She's from Gaza. I heard she's been through a lot," Layla whispered, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. I felt a pang of sympathy. Gaza was a name we heard often, a place that felt like a distant memory, yet somehow still present in our conversations. "What do you think it's like?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "I don't know," she replied, her voice soft. "I guess it's different from here. They say it's not safe." We fell into a thoughtful silence, the weight of her words hanging between us. I could hear the distant hum of chatter, the laughter of our friends, but there was an undercurrent of worry that seemed to seep into our conversations without us even realizing it. After school, I returned home, the sun beginning its descent in the sky. My mother was in the garden, tending to the few plants we managed to keep alive. She looked up and smiled as I approached. "Did you have a good day?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. "Yeah, we talked about a new girl in class," I replied, plopping down on the grass beside her. "She's from Gaza." My mother's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something in her eyes. "Gaza," she murmured, her voice low. "It's a complicated place." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. I wanted to ask her more, to understand the stories behind those words, but something in her tone made me hesitate. Instead, we sat in companionable silence, the sounds of our neighborhood wrapping around us like a warm embrace. The evening settled in, bringing with it the comforting routine of dinner preparations and lingering conversations. As we ate, I shared stories of my day, the ordinary moments that defined my life. My mother listened intently, her laughter infectious, her presence a steady anchor in the chaos of the world outside. But even as we enjoyed our meal, the radio in the background continued its soft murmur, the occasional mention of the conflict serving as a reminder of the reality we lived in. I could hear it, a faint echo of tension that contrasted with the warmth of our home, yet somehow, in that moment, I felt safe. I didn't realize how fleeting that feeling would be, how quickly everything would shift from the ordinary to the extraordinary, altering the course of our lives forever. As the night deepened, I settled into bed, the sounds of the city gradually fading into a soft hum. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the growing unease that seemed to creep in, the subtle reminders of a world in turmoil beyond the walls of my home. Little did I know that the stories my mother had kept hidden would soon intertwine with the reality of our lives, unraveling the fabric of our existence in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. As the days passed, the vibrant energy of my neighborhood began to shift. The mornings still unfolded with the familiar aroma of my mother's cooking, but there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't quite place. It was subtle, like the faintest hint of smoke lingering after a fire has been extinguished. The laughter of my friends as we played football felt a bit more strained, as if we were all trying to ignore an unspoken truth that loomed just beyond our field of vision. One afternoon, while walking home from school with Layla, I noticed a marked change in our surroundings. The usual chatter of vendors at the market seemed quieter, their voices lowered as if they were sharing secrets. I caught snippets of conversations about a siren test that had lasted longer than usual the previous evening. It was eerie, Layla said, her voice barely above a whisper. Like they were testing something, or warning us. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that it was just the usual gossip that circulated in our town. But as we passed by the market, I saw a group of elderly men gathered near the fruit stalls, their expressions serious and their eyes darting around as if expecting someone, or something, unwelcome to appear. One of them, Mr. Ibrahim, was standing with his hands clasped tightly, whispering to the wind as if seeking comfort from something beyond our understanding. When we reached home, I found my mother sitting at the table, her brow furrowed, staring blankly at the radio. It was silent, and I wondered if she had been waiting for a broadcast that never came. She looked up as I entered, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How was school?" she asked, her tone light. But I could sense the tension in her voice, a slight tremor that betrayed her. I hesitated before answering, feeling the knot in my stomach tighten. "It was fine," I replied, trying to mimic her nonchalance. "We had a new history lesson today." But the truth was, my mind was racing with thoughts of the siren, the whispers at the market, and the way the world suddenly felt more fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. That evening, the usual sounds of the neighborhood felt muted. The children played, but their laughter was tinged with an edge of nervousness, as if they too were aware of a shift in our reality. I caught a glimpse of a young boy sitting on the sidewalk, drawing in the dirt. He was sketching tanks with meticulous detail, his brow furrowed in concentration. I felt a chill run down my spine, the innocence of childhood clashing with the harsh images that seemed to invade our lives without warning. As night fell, a loud noise echoed in the distance, a rumbling that reverberated through the ground beneath my feet. I paused, my heart racing, and glanced at my mother. She was washing the dishes, her movements steady and practiced, but I could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her expression shifting to one of forced calm. "It's probably just the construction nearby," she said. But even as she spoke, I could see her hands trembling slightly as she dried a plate. I wanted to believe her, to dismiss the noise as just another part of life in our bustling neighborhood. But deep down, I felt the weight of uncertainty pressing against my chest. The next day, I walked to school alone. The streets felt emptier, and I sensed a collective unease in the air. I passed by Mrs. Khalil's house, and I noticed her sitting on the porch, staring out into the street with a distant look in her eyes. She didn't wave, didn't even acknowledge my presence. It was unusual for her. She was always the first to greet me with a warm smile. I felt a pang of worry for her and for our neighborhood, which suddenly felt like a fragile shell, ready to crack at the slightest disturbance. At school, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken fears. The teachers spoke in hushed tones, exchanging glances that lingered a moment too long. During recess, I overheard a group of boys whispering about a neighbor who had gone missing without explanation. They said he just packed up and left in the middle of the night. One of them said, his eyes wide. Nobody knows where he went. I felt a cold shiver run through me. I wanted to ask more, to understand what was happening, but every time I opened my mouth, my voice faltered. I glanced at Layla, who was sitting on the swings, her face drawn and pale. She caught my gaze and gave a small, forced smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I could see she felt it too. The sense that something was shifting beneath our feet, something we couldn't see but could certainly feel. Later that evening, as I sat at the dinner table, I watched my mother carefully arrange the food on our plates. The same comforting meals, but they tasted different, as if the flavors were overshadowed by the atmosphere that surrounded us. I wanted to ask her about the rumors, about the missing neighbor, about everything that felt wrong, but the words stuck in my throat. "Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. I hesitated, feeling the weight of everything unspoken hanging heavily between us. "You seem pensive," she noted, her voice softening. "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile. But inside, I felt the knot in my stomach tighten further, the dread pooling like a storm cloud ready to burst. It was as if we were all walking on a tightrope, balancing between the familiar and the unknown, trying to pretend that everything was normal while knowing deep down that it wasn't. As we finished our meal, I stole glances at my mother, who seemed lost in thought. I could sense her apprehension, the way her fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, the slight furrow in her brow. I wanted to reach out, to ask her to share her thoughts, but something held me back, an invisible barrier that neither of us dared to cross. And in that moment, I understood. We were both caught in a dance of denial, trying to maintain the facade of normalcy while the world outside began to shift and tremble, inching ever closer to the boiling point. The day began like any other, with sunlight filtering through the curtains and the familiar scent of my mother's cooking wafting through the air. I could hear the sizzle of onions in the pan, a sound that had always brought me comfort. But as I sat at the table, the weight in my chest felt heavier than before. I glanced at my mother, her brow furrowed in concentration as she stirred the pot, and I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over our home. After breakfast, I headed to school, my mind racing with thoughts. The chatter of my friends was a welcome distraction, but even their laughter felt strained. I caught Layla's eye during recess, and we exchanged a look that spoke volumes. We both knew something was off, but we couldn't quite name it. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, and it felt like we were all just waiting for something to happen. The school day dragged on, and the usual routine felt more like a performance than reality. We studied our lessons, but I could sense the whispers behind me. Rumors about neighbors who hadn't returned home, stories of sirens that echoed through the night. Each time the bell rang, I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. I wanted to believe it was just paranoia, but deep down, I feared it was more. As the day came to an end, I walked home slowly, my footsteps echoing against the pavement. The neighborhood looked the same, yet everything felt different. I reached our street and noticed a small crowd gathered near the end of the block. My heart raced as I approached, the whispers growing louder. I could see familiar faces, their expressions a mix of confusion and dread. I pushed through the crowd, my breath quickening. That's when I saw it. The house of our neighbor, Mr. Hassan, reduced to rubble. The remnants of his home lay scattered across the street, dust rising like a shroud. I felt my stomach drop, and I stumbled back, gripping a nearby lamppost for support. This was no longer a distant reality. It was here, invading my world. "Ollie, are you okay?" Layla's voice broke through the haze, pulling me back to the present. I turned to her, my mind racing as I tried to process what I had just seen. "Did this really happen?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "It was a bomb. They say it was an airstrike," she replied, her voice shaking. I felt the ground shift beneath me, as if the very earth had opened up to swallow the last shred of normalcy. I turned back to the destruction, my here. The days that followed the devastation of Mr. Hassan's home felt surreal, as if the world had been drained of color, leaving behind only shades of gray. I would sit at the edge of my bed, staring at the cracked wall, replaying the moment when I first saw the ruins. The dust swirling in the air seemed to echo the chaos in my mind, a constant reminder that everything I had taken for granted could vanish in an instant. I could still hear the low murmurs of the crowd outside, voices mingling with the distant wail of sirens. Each sound was a reminder of the fragility of our lives, of the thin veil separating safety from destruction. My mother would often talk about resilience, about how we must keep moving forward, yet I found myself paralyzed, caught in a storm of emotions I couldn't quite name. Guilt sat heavy in my stomach, twisting and turning as I thought about Mr. Hassan's family. They had lived next door for years, sharing simple pleasantries over the fence, and yet I felt I had done nothing to help them. What could I have done? I replayed those moments in my head, wishing I had knocked on their door that evening, wishing I had made them dinner or offered them a place to stay. I found myself drifting into memories of my mother, her soothing voice always encouraging me to be brave. But how could I be brave when fear wrapped around my heart like a vice? The weight of her unspoken stories hung in the air, shadows of her past as a nurse in Gaza, tales that never matched the official records I had always trusted. Why had she never shared those stories with me? Did she think I couldn't handle the truth? I wanted to reach out to her, to ask, but in those moments, I felt a barrier growing between us, as if her silence was a shield against the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I felt the familiar pang of anxiety. The shadows in the room deepened, and I glanced at the unfinished meal cooling on the table. I hadn't had an appetite since the bombing, the thought of food turning my stomach. I picked at the rice, each grain reminding me of the meals I used to share with Mr. Hassan and his family. A memory flickered to life, his laughter, the way he'd often tease me about my soccer skills. It felt cruel to remember those moments, knowing they would never happen again. My phone buzzed, a lifeline to the outside world, yet I hesitated to check it. What if it was bad news? What if it was someone I cared about? I gripped the chair, feeling the wood press into my palms. I could reach out to Layla, but what would I say? I didn't want to burden her with my fears. Instead, I let the phone slip from my fingers, landing softly on the floor as I sank deeper into my thoughts. The dilemma twisted inside me, relentless. Should I stay here, in this neighborhood, where the echoes of laughter had turned to whispers of dread? Or should I leave, escape to somewhere that felt safer? The thought of leaving filled me with despair. I didn't want to abandon my home, my memories, but the thought of facing another day filled with uncertainty was equally unbearable. I imagined a future where I could walk down the street without the looming threat of violence, yet the idea felt distant, like a dream too far to reach. What if I could help someone? What if I could reach out to a neighbor who might need assistance? But the fear of opening myself up to more pain held me back. I thought of Mr. Hassan's family and the possibility of finding them alive among the rubble. But what if I found nothing? What if I ventured into the danger and came back empty-handed? As night fell, the sounds of the city shifted. The laughter and singing that usually filled the air had been replaced by an eerie silence, punctuated only by the occasional distant siren. I felt a tightness in my chest, a panic creeping in as I imagined the worst. What if the sirens heralded another attack? What if I lost my mother, my only anchor in this tumultuous world? I wanted to scream, to cry, yet my voice felt trapped, stifled by the weight of my thoughts. I could feel tears threatening to spill as I paced the room, memories flooding over me like a tide. I remembered the summer days spent playing soccer, the warmth of the sun on my skin, the laughter of friends echoing in my ears. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, swallowed by the darkness that now loomed over us. I glanced at my reflection in the cracked mirror, my eyes wide and hollow, a stranger staring back at me. What was I supposed to do? I wanted to be brave, to face the world head-on, but every step felt like walking on a tightrope, the ground beneath me crumbling. I thought of reaching out to Layla one last time, to share this turmoil, but the fear of dragging her into my chaos held me back. Instead, I sat on the edge of my bed, feeling the exhaustion settle in my bones, and succumb to the silence surrounding me. The night stretched on, filled with unanswered questions and the heavy weight of my choices. I buried my face in my hands, feeling the tears finally escape, a release of all the fear and uncertainty. I knew I had to make a decision soon, but in that moment, I felt utterly lost, caught between the shadows of my fears and the flickering hope that one day, perhaps, we could reclaim our laughter. The day was heavy, the air thick with an unshakable tension that clung to my skin like a second layer. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring out the window at the street below. The familiar sounds of laughter and the vibrant calls of children playing football felt like echoes from a distant world, a world I no longer belonged to. My mind was a tempest of emotions, swirling with guilt, fear, and a desperate need to do something, anything, to break this paralyzing cycle of despair. I had been thinking about Mr. Hassan's family, their faces haunting my thoughts. I remembered the way he smiled, how he would always offer us sweet tea and tell stories of his youth. Now, that warmth was gone, replaced by an empty shell of a home and the echoes of sirens that had become a part of our landscape. The news of another bombing had spread like wildfire, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more, that I should have been braver. Then it hit me. I could help. I could make a choice that might change everything. With a sudden determination, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced across the rubble and debris. My heart raced as I made my way towards the makeshift community center that had been set up for the survivors. I could hear the faint sounds of people talking, the clatter of metal chairs, and the muffled sobs of those who had lost loved ones. As I approached, I saw a group of volunteers sorting through donations, clothes, food, medical supplies. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of my decision pressing down on me. But I couldn't turn back now. I stepped inside, the scent of disinfectant mixing with the faint whiff of sweat and fear. "Can I help?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman at the front looked up, her eyes tired but filled with a flicker of hope. She nodded, handing me a box of canned goods. I started sorting through them, trying to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept drifting back to Mr. Hassan's family. Hours passed, and I lost myself in the rhythm of helping. I moved from sorting supplies to packing bags for those in need, the repetitive motions grounding me. But then someone called my name, breaking my concentration. I turned to see a boy from my neighborhood standing at the door, his face pale and drawn. "Ali, you have to come. It's Mr. Hassan's family. They need you." Panic surged through me. I dropped the box I was holding and rushed out, my heart pounding. A few weeks passed since that chaotic day at the community center. The air outside still buzzed with tension, but within me, a fragile sense of calm had begun to settle. I had spent countless hours helping the families affected by the bombings, sorting through donations, and listening to stories that echoed my own pain. With each shared experience, I felt the weight of my guilt lifting, even if just a little. Every morning, I would wake up to the sound of my mother preparing breakfast. The familiar clatter of pots and pans now felt like a comforting ritual, a reminder that life persists even amidst destruction. I found solace in our shared meals, where we would exchange glances, each of us aware of the unspoken stories that lingered between us. My mother had a way of smiling that seemed to say, "We are still here." I began to notice the small things, the way the sun filtered through our kitchen window, casting golden patterns on the floor, or how the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wrapped around me like a warm hug. I would sit at the table, staring into my cup, lost in thought. Sometimes, I would catch myself writing letters that I never intended to send, words spilling onto the page like tears. I wrote about the families I had met, their losses, and the resilience they embodied. I wrote about Mr. Hassan's family, about how they had lost everything yet still found ways to smile. One afternoon, I found a photo of my mother in an old album. She was young, her eyes bright with hope, standing in the middle of a makeshift hospital in Gaza. The image stirred something deep within me. I realized that she had lived through a war of her own, one that had shaped her into the woman she was today. I wanted to ask her about it, to understand the stories that never matched the official records, but words caught in my throat. Instead, I gently placed the photo back in the drawer, as if it were a sacred secret meant to remain hidden. As time passed, I noticed changes in myself. I no longer felt paralyzed by fear. Instead, I began to embrace the uncertainty around me. I started volunteering more, not just at the community center, but also visiting families at their homes. I listened to their stories, shared their burdens, and slowly, bit by bit, I began to comprehend the depth of human resilience. In those moments, I felt less alone. We were all navigating this chaos together, each of us carrying scars that told tales of survival. One evening, I stood outside, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. It was a beautiful sight, starkly contrasting the reality I lived in. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. There was beauty even in the midst of despair. I had learned to find it, not just in the world around me, but within myself. The weeks turned into months, and as the seasons began to change, so did I. I learned to carry the memories of those I had lost, not as burdens, but as a part of my identity. They became my motivation to keep moving forward. I started to document my thoughts, writing about the people I met and the lessons I learned. I wanted to ensure that their stories would not be forgotten, that they would echo through time, reminding others of our shared humanity. One day, while cleaning out a closet, I stumbled upon an old coat of my mother's. It was worn and faded, yet it held the scent of her perfume. I held it close, feeling the weight of its fabric against my chest. This coat had once been a part of her, a shield against the cold. But now, it felt like a relic of a past she had tried to bury. I decided to hang it back up, a silent homage to her strength and the story she carried. I realized that I didn't need to know every detail of my mother's past to honor her. The essence of her experience was woven into my own journey. I learned that it was okay to let some questions remain unanswered, to embrace the uncertainty that life brings. As I stood there, I felt a profound shift within me. I understood that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying the memories with grace, allowing them to shape who we become. Just like the sunset that painted the sky, life is a mix of light and darkness, beauty and pain. It is in these moments of contrast that we find our true selves. And so, I continue on this path, one day at a time, carrying the stories of those around me and weaving them into my own. I am no longer paralyzed by fear or guilt, but instead fueled by compassion and a desire to make a difference. The world may remain chaotic, but within me lies a quiet transformation, a newfound clarity that guides my steps. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing. Stories like this need to be told and heard.